This is a University of Otago podcast.
And it's been great to have your careful consideration with our attendance here. It's really fun to have this opportunity to talk about fairness because my work began by looking at philosophy of sport, and debates about fairness are very much in the minds of those kinds of philosophers. So it's an opportunity for me to revisit some of that literature, but also to bring it to a wider audience. I did an undergraduate in sports science, within which I majored in philosophy, and then did a PhD in bioethics and looked at the use of enhancement technologies in sport, and then just after my PhD I ran straight into a master's degree where Colin taught me medical law, just for fun. And it's great to bring these things together because I think the questions about fairness apply across those broad subject areas. And what I want to do with this talk is try to set the scene for some of the issues that I think come up both within sport but within the subsequent day as well, and look at this notion of fairness and what it is that concerns us about fairness. It seems to me that there are a number of considerations that we need to make. Colin's, and I think Mark has made a very great introduction to those sorts of ideas. What I want to do is try to raise a number of provocations that address questions that I think broadly concern the discussion about the future of fairness and where it might take us. As Colin said, there are no questions as poignant as those which affect our future generations. And it seems to me that what's at stake with regard to the future of fairness is a way in which we may change humanity to effectively transform the way in which we distribute justice, but also the expectations we have of other people as well. So if that undergraduate student does succeed more effectively than the peers within the class that don't use the enhancement, is this something that we regard to be fair? And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. But it seems to me that those questions of desert and the rewards and achievements that people gain in life are suddenly becoming brought into question. And when we change those conditions, the conditions within which the rewards we achieve are restructured, do we change society in quite fundamental ways? And there's a kind of assumption that the future of fairness has something to do with technology. And whilst this will come up, and looking at the titles of the lectures, technology is a part of this discussion, it's not clear to me that it's just high technology that matters. And what I will suggest with a few sort of examples is that in fact the way in which fairness operates within practices like sport today are quite complicated. There are various notions of fairness that are in operation. And I think the impact of technology is only likely to affect part of that discussion. The broader context, as Colin suggested, referring to the Brock and Buchanan book, From Chance to Choice, which frames this in quite helpful ways. What's happening, particularly with regards to technology, is that we are moving from a situation whereby we are effectively determined by the genetic lottery and the conditions into which we are born, to a situation where we can make choices about what those conditions might be. And typically this coheres with a very popular notion of within medical ethics that somehow promoting autonomy, promoting informed choices is something that we should value, something that we should try to promote within our institutions, and not just within medicine and healthcare, but generally within life. It's something that we should value to try to promote informed consent and the ability to take our own decisions in life. And why should we be restricted from doing that? So it seems to me that there's something appealing about the idea of moving from chance to choice. But of course, we're reminded of John Stuart Mill's caveat that we may only do that providing our actions don't harm others. And I think the key question here is what sorts of harms may arise from the use of things like human enhancement, genetic modification, and so on. Are these simply self-regarding modifications? Do they only affect ourselves? Or do they affect others around us, not just those close to us, but our broader communities, and indeed society in general? And it seems to me that that's a crucial consideration here. But our expectations of fairness, I think, are also complex. And a few sort of case studies reveal how ambiguously we feel about fairness in things like sports. But where do we locate sports? There's an idea that fairness is somehow this kind of noble practice. It's not a very great resolution here, but the video is a clip of the 100 best knockouts. And what you're seeing here is fair competitions. Two men in a ring, pretty much no rules within the fight, and the idea is to just destroy your opponent. And you can look at this and think, gosh, that looks brutal, violent, terrible. But it's a fair contest. They're playing by the same rules. There's nothing here that should concern us with regard to equality. So the idea that fairness has something to do with the noble values of sport, I think, is something that we need to put aside. Fairness can equally be a very brutal and aggressive characteristic of any particular practice we may enjoy. But the complexities arrive in the stories about sports experiences that we're familiar with, where our assumptions about fairness are quickly brought into question. This example here, whereby a golfer arrives at a tournament and her golf clubs have not turned up to the competition, that airline misplaced them and they didn't arrive. What should be done here? If another player that's present has a spare set of golf clubs, should they give them to the player that's without? Should they allow them to compete within the competition? Or should they say, tough luck, your clubs didn't arrive, I'm the winner? And there's nothing within the rules that specifies what ought to be done here. If you are the one that's seeking to win, then why should you loan your spare set of clubs to the person that has lost theirs? Your goal is to win. So we can't look at the rules and find out what's fair in this situation. I think sports are helpful in discussions about fairness because they provide examples that make it difficult for us to see what ought to describe our notion of fairness. And it goes beyond those formal elements of the rules themselves. Another example, Anita, a high jumper, has developed a new method that would allow her to get a much greater edge on her competitors. It would improve her high jump considerably. But it's a secret. The method that she's developed, she doesn't want to tell anyone about it because she knows that as soon as she shows everybody, others will copy it, and very quickly she will lose her competitive advantage. So she decides to hold it back until the Olympic Games. She practices it in her, and she knows it's within the rules, but keeps it secret until the Games time. The competition comes, she competes, she demonstrates her new technique, which everyone's just blown away by. She shaves centimetres off the world record, transcending it considerably, and wins the gold medal. Do we regard that to be fair? Is this something that we think is an acceptable way of the competition taking place? Perhaps not. Does this change if that method by which she arrives at that enhancement involves the amputation of her leg? Now, this might seem a peculiar segue into a slightly related topic, but one of the discussions that surrounds human enhancements, and indeed the use of prosthetic technologies, is the possibility that if we find ourselves in a situation where the prosthetic device, whether we think of it as a supplement, a drug, or an artificial limb, would allow someone to be better than its biological counterpart, then would we create a society where people willingly do things like amputate their limbs in order to be enhanced for particular kinds of activities? This is something that people are considering quite carefully, particularly as we see athletes like Oscar Pistorius, the South African double below the knee amputee runner, who's quickly gaining pace on the so-called able-bodied athletes in the Olympic Games. And we might see a future whereby the prosthetically enhanced athlete is someone who is revered much more than the present so-called able-bodied athletes. So this may be a consequence of that kind of value system. Another example. Danny's an elite skier who's discovered a great new legal wax for his skis, which will shave seconds of his time. He decides, foolishly perhaps, to tell his competitors he's a fair-playing kind of guy if he wants to compete against people that are competing on the same terms. So he tells the competitors, look, you should really use this new wax. It's going to make the competition even more exciting. It's going to make it a better kind of competition. The other competitors don't trust Danny, and they decide to think, well, this may work, it may not work, we're going to leave it. We're going to keep going with our own methods and just see how it goes. The competition takes place, Danny wins by seconds, and the others are quite grumpy and upset by this. But was it fair? They had the chance to use the technology, but they chose not to do it. I think, again, this describes the nature of the fairness debate with regard to sport technologies. It's not clear that having the same technology is something that would make sports fair. And finally, to the case that Colin alluded to, talking about a student who may seek to, because of anxieties, because of an inability to sleep or to cram, seeks a form of cognitive enhancement that would put them in a position where they could more effectively deal with the stress of an upcoming exam. How should we feel about that? Colin said, are we happy about that idea? And I think the idea is that we are transforming the means through which we achieve. And we believe, perhaps mistakenly, that the rewards we gain from putting in effort are due to our own volition, to our own, the effort that we make with regard to studying or training or whatever it is you might do. But it has something to do with our own abilities and our own desires and our own perseverance that determines our results. Now, within sports, this is a very difficult claim to make because we know, of course, that athletes are surrounded by a range of people that help them get to that point. But nevertheless, to the extent that we accept that some part of what we achieve has something to do with our own efforts, this kind of example frustrates that idea. It suggests a situation whereby what we've achieved is not only to do with those efforts we make, but the technologies that we use. And it seems to me the problem in the case is that we imagine David within his class and his cohort and achieving more than they've achieved because he had the enhancement. But in fact, this is only part of that circle of solidarity that we should be focused on. David is part of a broader culture. He's within one school. How should we feel about him in the context of the broader educational program? Perhaps David is within a very good school. Perhaps he's in a poor school. Should we feel differently about his use of that technology depending on how we see the quality of the school that he's in? That might be the boundary around which we need to frame this question. So these topics, these case studies, provide a way into thinking about how fairness is very complex. We don't have a clear sense of what kind of fairness we desire in sports, but also outside. Is it equality of opportunity or equality of ends? Do we want to put the conditions in place that allow people to go for the same goals, or do we want people to end up in the same place? I may come back to that, but the other side of the discussion has to do with the future, which is a very slippery concept. So when we think about and pose a question about the future, I think first of all it invokes all sorts of notions about what that might be, what sort of future it might be. Is it a utopian future? Is it dystopian? What sort of world will it look like? And we're informed, of course, by films Colin mentioned, Gattaca, artistic interpretations of the potential futures that inform our sense of the present and where we might wish to go. But it seems to me we need to spend some time thinking about how we should regard the future, what kind of thing the future is. Because, of course, it's unreasonable just to say what will happen in the future. Because what are we talking about? Are we talking about 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years? How should we frame this topic? Clearly, we're concerned, at least immediately, about our lifetimes. We're concerned about what may happen to us within our own lifetimes. We may also be concerned about what may affect our children, future generations, and so on. The survivability of the species, perhaps. But we need to set some limits on our discussion about this topic. The modern Olympic Games has only been around for just over 100 years, and the culture and values of that particular Games differs remarkably from the ancient Olympic Games from over 2,000 years ago. So when we think about something like sport, which is a helpful, specific kind of set of practices to focus the debate, what future do we think of for sports? Is it something that's 100 years in the future? How far can we go before those speculations become far too broad? And within bioethics, within applied discussions about the future of healthcare and so on, people have very particular views about how far we should go. Some feel strongly that we should only look at the next few years. 10 may be too much, 20 may be too much, in part because the way in which any particular technology will develop is very contingent. It may depend on the kind of funding that's in place that may allow it to flourish or wither. But we certainly need to set some limitations on our discussion about the future in order for it to have some meaning. Equally, it's very hard to compel people with arguments about the future that are 10,000 years ahead. How should we feel about that kind of concern? It, I think, is very difficult to persuade people. So we should also be conscious that those propositions about the future have differing degrees of persuasiveness, and it requires us to make some clear relationship between what is possible, what is feasible, and what might in some realm of possibility, be attainable within a certain period of time. I think a lot of the discussions today will focus on what will happen in sports over the next 50 years. And I think that's a reasonable amount of time to look at how the technologies that surround it may evolve. But it's certainly critical that we make those kinds of stipulations in our speculation about change, because change is so fickle. So how do you put these two things together and think about technology? How will technologies affect the future? Will they affect fairness in sport? What is the specific role that technology will play? And of course, 50 years seems reasonable when we look at sports from 50 years ago and see how much has changed. And a great deal has changed, as was mentioned at the start, that we, whilst we might look at the rules and see there are still remnants of the same game being played, some of those rules have changed. The athletes themselves have changed dramatically. I remember in 1999, the Tennis Association was very concerned about the dominance of the serve within the male game. This was becoming a game just of serves. And of course, people that value tennis are quite excited by the serve. It's a powerful part of the sport, but it's not the entire game. People like to see rallies. People like to see that contest and negotiation that takes place between two players. And without that, something is lost. So they experimented with all sorts of ideas about how to slow down the serve, make the ball bigger, raise the height of the net, make the court a bit bigger. All these propositions were put in place to try to affect this sport in quite important ways. One sort of caveat here is that it's not just about the sports themselves, it's also about the spectators' appreciation of the sports. Similar discussions have taken place in ice hockey, in table tennis, where the sports organisations have also tried to make the sport visually engaging for a television audience, because if they can't engage the TV audience, they can't grow the sport, and so on. So there are practical considerations that affect these debates as well. Not least of which occurred within javelin in the 1980s, when athletes were getting so good at throwing the javelin that they were beginning to endanger people within the stadium. And of course, it's all very good to be breaking world records, but to be breaking people in half isn't such a great thing for the public profile of the sport, or indeed for the spectator that's affected. So they changed the technology, and the sport became less a game, a practice that was decided by the strongest throwers, and more decided by the technically proficient throwers. Which is why you look at a javelin thrower and they're not beefy people, they're people that have really fast arms. And so these sorts of decisions are made with regard to other sorts of interests that the sports might have, not wholly to do with fairness. But they are affected by technology. And it seems to me that we can look at technologies to identify ways in which fairness is affected. So the idea that this screenshot from Time magazine in 1972, I think it is, no, 78, sorry, of the test tube baby became this metaphor for how we might change humanity in a way that does alter those conditions. Now, IVF is an application that you can see has the capacity to make society fairer, or at least it allows people a means through which they can achieve the goal of procreation, where previously they would not have that possibility. So it gives people something that that we regard to be a human right, and arguably equalises the playing field in allowing them to do that, even though it's controversial, even though people feel that this is something that may be challenging certain notions of what it means to be human. But we've gone a bit further since then. This is a screenshot from a website called Ron's Angels, which came up in 1999. Ron Harris created an entity that would be auctioning off sperm and ova so that we could indeed purchase the genes of our future generations via an auction. The highest bidder gets the genes for their child. And you can see here a screenshot of one of the donors of the company. One sort of caveat here: this was covered throughout the world. All sorts of media organisations covered this new entity. It was subsequently revealed that Ron Harris is a pornographic film director, and that the people that were donating their sperm and ova were also actors within his films, which the photograph perhaps conveys. But this, I think, is sort of helpful in revealing to us how far we may wish to take this. Because arguably, why shouldn't an auction be a legitimate means through which to determine what sorts of genes people get? Why should it be something that's simply about the genetic lottery? So, does a world where we imagine this future of human cloning and genetic selection, a world that is highly technologized, whereby people can make choices about the kinds of characteristics they have or their future children have, would this improve fairness, or would it, as Colin alluded to in Lee Silver's terms, lead to a gen-poor society where we have a divided society of those that have the means of technology and those that don't? I think that actually it won't. I think that the expansion of technology will allow people to achieve greater inequality within society. The challenge is always when technologies begin, and they tend to be very expensive, they tend to be affordable only by people that have the means, but as they develop, they become much more accessible, much more affordable to a range of people. For those of you that do play tennis, most likely, unless you're still one of those traditionalists that plays with a wooden racket, the racket that you actually play with has been developed from composite materials at NASA. There is a trickle-down effect whereby the expansion of the technology does lead to its affordability, and I think this is an appealing idea both within sports but outside of it as well. I also don't think we'll have less concern about each other, or indeed the idea of fairness, in a world of enhancement technologies. I think it's something that enhances the game. It makes it more exciting. So the technology, the wax that shaves seconds off the skier's time, makes for a more exciting contest. It also, I think, coheres well with what sports are all about, and that's trying to develop natural talents in combination with technological apparatus, whether that's a piece of scientific knowledge that transforms our understanding about how to perform. The Fosbury flop in high jump was a great example. The O'Brien shuffle in shot put, where you spin round and throw the putt as opposed to just launch it out, was another great example. These innovations transform the sport significantly, but I think in helpful and positive ways. And I think we have to look to the ethos of sports to identify this. Now, the ethos of sports is such that many would lead you to believe that it's very much against doping practices, and that's of course true. Athletes don't want to be playing sports, don't be involved with competitions where their opponents are using radically different means to themselves. So if you're a marathon runner, you don't really want to be competing with someone who's on roller skates, because this is not really what you signed up for. You didn't agree to those means, and so their use is something that is going to prejudice your ability to compete. But I don't think that enhancement technologies are always like roller skates. I think that often they allow athletes to gain, to put more effort into the competition and gain an advantage in that way. I think also if sports feel that the technology does make the activity more exciting, somehow enriches the characteristics that they seek to test, then this is something that we can value as well. And it seems to me that sports are this peculiar entity that has always been a front runner of enhancement technologies, a practice that is constituted by technology in such radical ways, some of which we identify, some of which we fail to identify. The idea of a running track, the idea of a stadium at all, is a technological apparatus. It is a set of conditions that leads us to believe that it's creating something that allows us to measure the world's fastest person, but this is entirely a construction. It's a set of conditions that we've assembled in order to make certain distinctions between people. And so they are both practices that are enamoured by technology, that seek to foster the use of technology, but also reject it in certain ways, in cases like doping. But it seems to me that as technology develops, sports will become increasingly the subject of human enhancement, and this in fact aligns them with the direction of humanity more generally. It's not the case that sports would be any different from the broader culture of human enhancement that we see beginning to flourish in society. In fact, I think that the pursuit of them, characterised by these slides here, which shows you the amount of interest that there is in enhancement technologies in sport, the idea of trying to push the body and the mind beyond what it has achieved before, I think is perfectly in keeping with how we regard ourselves and how we regard the pursuit of humanity as a pursuit of trying to explore the potential of ourselves in combination with technological apparatus. Now, the visions of this future vary, and I think they impact upon our discussions often. It's called by one bioethicist as the yuck factor. This is a shot of a printer, and you might have heard discussions about being able to print organs recently, which has become quite developed in the last few years. The idea that we create farms whereby we can manufacture organs is filled with these kind of dystopian ideas that seem to suggest that we're creating, some would say, unhuman monsters that will lead to the replacement of humanity. It will somehow dehumanize us in a way that we should not seek to bring about. But I think these visions are quite unclear. I think we could equally see this possible future as a very beautiful exploration of our own biology. It certainly could lead to our enlightenment about ourselves, about what makes us human in terms of biology, but also, I think, culturally. And I think, therefore, the views about how we should feel about this technology have a lot to do with that aesthetic content that's brought to bear on how we regard the future. When you discuss fairness in sport, it tends to be about doping and drug taking. And, of course, the story is set up in a very regimented way. Someone's cheating and someone's suffering as a result of that. But in actual fact, irrespective of the banned substance list, irrespective of those things that are prohibited, there's so much within sports that is about celebrating inequality that I think it is disingenuous to suggest that, in fact, we should seek fairness within sports. Sports are all about revealing inequalities. Thank you very much.